Normally when I stand here and deliver a talk, it's after weeks of deep research, but tonight most of this story comes from my heart rather than the pages of a history book. I'm not a military historian, and this is a personal story, and one that I would never believe that I could tell as I grew up. And to tell my story, I need to explain a little bit about my paternal family background. My dad was born here in Dover in 1938. He was the youngest of 3 children, all born within 3 years. When he was around 6 months old, his parents' marriage broke down, and the 3 children were given away to different families. Sadly, my dad was to be passed around for 2 years before being adopted into a local family in 1940. The war took over the years that followed, and Dad was told that he was adopted, and he remembers seeing his birth brother once as a very young child, and his sister, he saw her a few times. As a child, Dad was occasionally taken to see his maternal grandmother, and he was told that she had lost her husband in Mons. And he remembers her as a lady with watery, sad eyes, who always looked like she'd been crying. And it was common knowledge at home as I grew up that Dad had a brother and that he'd never met. Apart from that fleeting meeting as young children, and we absolutely had no idea where he could possibly be. We only had the telephone book. I remember looking through, as a child, the telephone book and wondering if that particular person could be my dad's brother. It was just so important to me. We knew his sister was somewhere, and I must own this because if I asked my dad now, his adopted family were his family, but he knew of his birth family as well. And I think from here, really, it's my story trying to find them. He knew that his great-granddad had been killed in Mons, what he thought. He knew he had possibly an uncle that was the bandmaster of the Black Watch, and he thought that he had maybe an aunt that was the head of the Alexandra Nursing Corps, but he wasn't sure, and as you know, as I say, life plodded on. But me personally, I've always had a feeling of being in limbo when it came to who my dad, my brother and I really were. Dad had joined the Royal Marines at 14, he joined the band. 14 and a half he was. Luckily, my mum had a huge, close family in Dill, and they didn't differentiate between my mum and my dad. My family were my family. When my dad was adopted, the people that adopted him were a lot older. He was 2, and they were 50 and 52. So they were more like grandparents, really, and they died in the 70s. I didn't really know them. I remember going to see my Nana Powell a few times, but I didn't really know them. By the time I became a teenager, the dream of finding my dad's lost heritage and family started to grow stronger. I love my dad a lot, and I just wanted to do this for him. I felt as if something was missing. I can't really explain how I felt. I just couldn't leave it. But the years rolled on, and I remember from being such a young age that I used to daydream about a day when I could say, "Dad, I found your brother," but I didn't know where to start. And I remember the Salvation Army, obviously they used to look for lost relatives, and I actually went there in the 1990s, and I got a form. It was a pink form, I remember, and I came away and I thought, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to fill this in. I don't know if he was alive, if he was dead, if it would open a can of worms. I really didn't know what to do, so I never did fill that form in. But in the early 2000s, like a lot of people, we got a PC, and eventually we went on the internet, which was a major thing then, wasn't it? Are you on the internet? No. So my son just used to do the colouring thing really on it, and that's all. And suddenly, although we didn't realise at the time, the world had become a much smaller place, and mysteries all over would be solved much more easily, as we now know. And I joined Ancestry, and a few months later I ordered my dad's birth certificate and his parents' marriage certificate, and we were starting to fill in some of the blanks at last. I know you can't see this. I realised earlier on that you couldn't see this from back there, but and I should have done a smaller one. But on the end, we had my dad's birth parents. This is their marriage certificate. We've got John Herbert Marsh and Lillian Mary Baker. We had the maiden name that we needed. And not only that, but we could now see her father's name and his rank and his regiment. And that was the first time we ever saw the name that would come to mean so much, Joseph Samuel Baker. And one of my dad's middle names is Joseph, so the connection was growing. And armed with this new information, we began to search and discovered that Joseph died on the 26th of August 1914 during the Battle of Le Cateau. And he was buried in N communal cemetery nearby. And from then on, it became a family focus to go to the cemetery and pay our respects. My dad, a Royal Marine musician to his core, wanted to play the last post personally for his newly discovered Grandad. And as I said, military history isn't really my strong point, but Dad was captivated with his newly discovered ancestor, and he spent many hours reading up on the battle. Dover historian Phil Eden actually gave us a war journal covering the days of the battle too. Now, with my basic knowledge, we know that Joseph's regiment sailed from Folkestone to Boulogne, marched for about 3 days in torrential rain, and then was told to dig shallow trenches before being ambushed. And I use this knowledge as my gratitude yardstick. Whenever I'm feeling a bit sorry for myself, I think about those poor souls, exhausted, frightened, and soaked through. And for them, it didn't get any better. And I'm going to leave it to the expert to bring you a short history of the battle here. I found a video of Jon Snow.
In late August 1914, the British Army was retreating out of Belgium into France with the Germans pursuing them. The British Expeditionary Force was organised into 2 corps, and by the 25th of August, the exhausted troops of the British Second Corps stopped for a brief rest in and around the town of Le Cateau in northern France. Their commander, General Smith-Dorrien, looked at the situation. He thought he might have to stop and fight the pursuing Germans just to buy his men some breathing space, buy them some time. So at 2 a.m. on the 26th of August, Smith-Dorrien said to his divisional commanders, "Very well, gentlemen, we will fight." Only a few hours later, at 6 a.m, German artillery started pounding the British. At that stage of the war, the British didn't really realise the importance of digging deep trenches, and so they were in shallower rifle pits, and that German artillery took a heavy toll. The Germans followed up with infantry attacks. And this was the last battle in which, in British history certainly, in which men sort of manoeuvred as if they were on a parade ground, in plain view of the other side, as generals and messengers galloped around on horses from unit to unit. The British took a heavy toll on the attacking Germans. But on the British right wing, there was a gap between First Corps and Second Corps, and German troops infiltrated, so that attacking the British from their flanks as well. One German witness said, "Our men attacked with the utmost determination, but again and again they were driven back by these incomparable soldiers. Regardless of loss, the English artillery came forward to protect their infantrymen, and in full view of our own guns, they kept up a devastating fire." One British survivor said that they took a terrible toll on the attacking Germans. He said, "It's a marvel that anyone there is alive and untouched." But by mid-afternoon, the British forces had started to retreat. That's a very hard thing to do, is to retreat in the face of the enemy while you engage the enemy, but the British professionals did it well. Some places, though, units were cut off and made futile last stands, like the Gordon Highlanders and the Yorkshires at the right-hand end of the British line. Many of their men ended up killed, wounded, or captured. This was really the last old-fashioned battle in British history. British troops had been using the tactics of the Napoleonic age, really, but with the technology of 20th century weaponry. The tenacity of the British troops meant that the retreat that followed was chaotic, but it wasn't a rout. And actually, General Smith-Dorrien had delivered a stopping blow. He had succeeded in what he wanted to do, but he'd suffered heavy casualties, around 5,000 men. But he got a 12-hour head start, allowing his men to get away, regroup, and fight the Germans later in the campaign. It was the biggest British battle for generations, but it would soon be dwarfed by what followed.
watching that heartbreaking. The loss of life of men and animals is devastating. And any one of those British soldiers that we've just seen could have been my great-granddad. I have no idea. I have no photographs. But the years slipped by and some big life changes got in the way of our bucket list trip. And with hindsight, maybe this was meant to be. Because in 2018, I was lucky enough to go on a camping holiday to the south of France. And looking at the map, I could see it was easy to visit Le Cateau on the way back to Calais. So my partner and I planned it in, and the idea is we would get to an overview before we made the trip as a family. I didn't tell anybody we was going to do this. It was just going to be a bit of a surprise. And I remember being so overwhelmed as we got closer, and then when I saw this, I was just beside myself with emotion. I was actually here, Le Cateau. And we drove into the town and we visited the main cemetery to look at the war graves. But I knew this wasn't the right place, and the name cemetery that is shown, but it must be nearby. And we drove out of the town for about 20 minutes, following the map instructions, and ended up on what looked like a dead-end road. And the houses, as we drove up, the houses sort of stopped, they just disappeared really. It reminds me a little bit of, I don't know, maybe Crossroads and Deal or something like that, but as we see, it goes there. But I didn't see this at the time, but you can see the cross poking up over the top. And I didn't actually see that, because all I could see was that field. I was thinking, but it can't be here. And this was so important to me. But then suddenly, we found ourselves here. And this is N Cemetery. It's a communal cemetery. And obviously, when the men were killed, they were reburied here shortly afterwards. And it was just a tiny town, a tiny local cemetery, and they were given a small piece of this. It's really tiny. How can I describe how I was feeling? Well, I walked in and I was still in disbelief. And after only a few seconds, I was stood in front of a grave of a brave World War I soldier who was also my great-granddad. A young man who I hadn't known existed until relatively recently. 8293 Lance Corporal J.S. Baker, Lancashire Fusiliers, who died on the 26th of August 1914, aged 29. He had left behind a young wife and 5 young children, 2 of whom were twins. We needed to press on and get back to Calais, but I made a vow to my great-granddad that I would come back and bring the rest of the family, and I left him a rose. It was a really odd feeling, but I could imagine him lying there with his fallen comrades, waiting patiently for those 114 years, when eventually here we were, driving over the brow of the hill, having found him. Suddenly he didn't seem quite so lost anymore. And around this time, a picture appeared on Facebook, and it totally floored me. This was how I was feeling, but I just couldn't put it into words. I think it says it all, doesn't it? And when we got home, we made plans to return soon. And as I said, it couldn't have been a better year, as this was the 100th anniversary of Armistice. So in November, we went back, taking my mum and my son. Sadly, mainly for health and passport reasons, my dad couldn't come with us. And we planned to go to the cemetery on the Saturday, and we made our way to make our way back home on the Sunday. And driving there, the weather was appalling. It was absolutely chucking it down. But by early afternoon, just as we arrived, the rain stopped and the sun came out. And I'm not just saying this for artistic, this really is how it happened. And the sun came out just as we got out of the cars. And it began shining directly onto great-granddad's new flower, which we'd taken there for him. And it was shining right on the flower. And just opposite the entrance across the field, there was a beautiful rainbow. And by now, I'd put our story so far onto the internet, and I'd been contacted by a lady who was related to another soldier killed on the same day. And she asked if we could put a photograph of the soldier's young family onto his grave. And so he did. And that's his young family there. And we were honoured to do that for the family. And later in the afternoon, we were treated to this stunning sunset. It was absolutely beautiful there. And while we were moving around in the cemetery, I was taking pictures and we were speaking, a chap walked past the cemetery, and he was walking his dogs up the narrow country road, and he spoke to my partner. And he said that if we were interested, tomorrow on the Sunday, there would be a service at the cemetery at 10:15. So we went back the following day. And there was absolutely loads of people, and it was like we didn't really know what we'd walked into at this point. And then we was milling around with all these people, and then we suddenly realised, because this guy approached us, he was actually the mayor of the town of N. And they invited us to the ceremony, and all the townspeople were there, and they obviously did this every year, but of course this was a special year as it was the 100th anniversary of Armistice. But the townspeople stood around the outside, and by mistake I walked in and I started to go into the square with the dignitaries. And I said, oh, and I sort of walked backwards, and they said, no, we want you in here with us, because you've come here, you are from England, and you've come here as a representative of these men, and we want you here with us. And so we stood there as a family, and they played both national anthems, they played the last post, and we were guests of honour during all of this, and it's absolutely breathtaking, it really was, and we were so proud to be standing there. And when the ceremony finished, we was invited down to the town square to their personal ceremony for the villagers who had lost their lives, living almost on a front line. And then afterwards, we was invited back to the town hall. We walked out of the cemetery with the mayor and began our walk down to the town square. And as we did this, he pointed across the fields to Longsart Farm and told us this is where the battle was. And you can see where the heart is, that's where the battle was. And the other bit is where the cemetery is. So it wasn't very far away, it was just across the fields. And we walked down to the town square. We joined in. I couldn't take many pictures, obviously it wasn't the right time really, but I'll just show you the village. And they all join in, they all knew all the words to everything, and they were really part of it. And this was a commemoration of all the people, like I said, that had died from the village, and it was really important to them. And there was a plaque that in memory of the 112 soldiers, British soldiers, of the 4th Division Infantry who died on the 26th of August 1914 in the Battle of Longsart at N. It's also a memory of the New Zealand Division who went back and liberated the town in 1918, which was the graves that we'd seen when we actually went to Locato. But this was my great-granddad's battle, and this was in N at Longsart Farm at the time. And we went back to the village hall, and again we were guests of honour. Everybody was just wonderful. And my mum met a lady called Danielle, and they were talking. Mum doesn't speak French, she didn't speak English, but they were talking. And my mum said to me, shall I give the lady my poppy pin? And I said, no, why are you going to give her that? And she said, I want to give it to her. And I said, oh, okay then. And she took her poppy pin off, and she gave it to this lady. And this woman she was just overwhelmed. She was suddenly then, she was crying. And I've actually got a picture here of, this is Le Bluet, because I've got my form teacher here who's French, and I've just asked her how to say that. But this is the French version of our poppy. And they wear this in remembrance and solidarity with World War I veterans. And it's a cornflower. And like the poppy, it continued to grow in lands devastated by the thousands of shells which were launched daily by the entrenched armies on the Western Front. And these flowers were only the visible evidence of life and the only sign of colour in the mud of the trenches, along with our poppies. And we stayed with our unexpected hosts for several hours, But then we had to leave to get back home, and we came away almost disbelieving what had just happened. And we left Joseph, great-granddad, in the care of the Commonwealth War Grain Commission, and our lovely new friend, Danielle, who regularly goes to the grave and takes flowers for us and sends my mum updates. And when we speak of the war, there are no happy endings, and sometimes the enormous tragedy of it can be overwhelming. But now, at the end of my story, there is a little silver lining here. So what became of the 3 babies who were given away? My dad's sister, Jean, I found her when I was 14, which was quite a few years ago now. And off I went one day on a train, and I actually found her, but unfortunately they lost contact. As you can imagine, it's been a difficult time for everybody. And so here we are so many years later, I won't tell you quite how many. But Brian, my dad's brother, was still just a name. And I think actually sometimes I was afraid to start searching again, because if I found that he wasn't here anymore, then I couldn't fulfil my dream. They were both just names hanging on my Ancestry family tree until one day, while doing yet another search, I found the grave of my paternal great-grandparents, and this one was only in Dover. So off we went again, and here I am. And I had asked on Facebook Dover History page several times if anybody knew about Dad's birth family, but nothing had come of it. But the evening that I posted this, my second cousin, who I didn't know, saw it and contacted me. A few days later, we were speaking on the phone, and shockingly, she knew Dad's long-lost brother, and she had his phone number. They were cousins, and they'd actually been brought up almost as brother and sister. Literally, as we were speaking, I received an email, and this is where it gets really weird. And this was from a woman who had contacted me via DNA that day, and she wondered why we were second cousins. And then she mentioned that her nan was adopted. So after years of wondering, I had found my dad's brother and sister within half an hour of each other. So all because of a photograph at a graveside, this photograph. Earlier this year, I could say the words that I'd always wanted to say. Dad, I found your brother. And on the 21st of April this year, Dad's 83rd birthday, I arranged for Dad, his brother and sister to meet up for the first time since they were toddlers. And there they are. I have much more discovering to do yet, as I've since found that my grandmother, their mum, was born in Dublin, and I have deep Irish roots, so who knows where my story will take me. But a little piece of my story tonight is the last little piece of my last picture. And you remember that I said that the rain stopped and there was a beautiful rainbow. And the next day, as I walked out of the cemetery with the mayor, he pointed out that my great-grandfather would have died in the field opposite, where the water tower is. So on the way back to Calais, back in November, I remembered the 2 things and looked back through the many photographs of the weekend. And I was astounded to realise that at the end of the rainbow, the afternoon before, it fell exactly where the mayor had said my great-granddad was killed, right by the water tower. And I've got a picture of that. Can you see the rainbow there? And then that was the following day when the mayor told me where it was. So unfortunately, my dad has never really been well enough to fulfil his wish of playing the last post for his granddad. But this evening I'm honoured to say that we have Andy Cornish with us. And he's going to do that for my dad and for my great-granddad and for everybody that has fallen. So I would invite you to stand for the last post. Thank you.
Hi folks, I hope you enjoyed the video. Finally, I'd like to say a huge thanks to all of the History Project sponsors. Without your continued support, none of the good work we do would even be possible, so thank you.